The moment everyone laughed was the moment the truth began to change direction. The crystal lights above cast a soft golden glow across the dining room, reflecting off polished glasses and silver cutlery arranged with perfect precision, and yet beneath that elegance, something colder lingered, something unseen but quietly present. Clara Whitmore moved through the room like she always did, quiet, efficient, almost invisible, her black uniform pressed neatly, her posture straight, her eyes calm but distant, as if she had learned long ago that being unnoticed was safer than being seen. The piano played gently in the background, each note floating through the air like a whisper, filling the silence between conversations that never truly included her. At table 12, Victor Langford leaned back in his chair, his tailored suit immaculate, his presence commanding without effort, the kind of man who never had to ask for attention because the room adjusted itself around him. He spoke with measured confidence, his voice low but carrying just enough weight that people listened even when they pretended not to, and tonight, he was enjoying it, every glance, every nod, every subtle acknowledgement of his authority. Clara approached his table with a steady hand, balancing a tray of drinks, her movements precise, practiced, unaffected by the subtle tension that seemed to gather wherever Victor Saturday. "Your bourbon, sir," she said softly, placing the glass in front of him with care, her voice even, respectful, controlled. Victor didn't look at her at first. He let the silence stretch just a second too long, as if deciding whether she was worth acknowledging, then finally glanced up, his eyes sharp, assessing. "That's not what I ordered," he said, his tone casual, but loud enough that the people around him heard it clearly. Clara paused, just for a fraction of a second, her fingers tightening slightly around the edge of the tray, but her expression didn't change. "I'm sorry, sir," she replied, her voice steady. "You asked for a single-barrel bourbon neat." Victor let out a small laugh, the kind that didn't invite anyone to join, but they did anyway, because that's what people did. Around men like him. "No," he said, leaning forward slightly, his eyes narrowing just enough to turn curiosity into discomfort. "I asked for something better." A few people at the table chuckled, exchanging glances, the kind of shared amusement that comes easily when someone else is the subject. Clara didn't respond immediately. She didn't apologize again. She didn't argue. She simply stood there, still as the room continued to move around her, the soft piano notes filling the space where her voice might have been. Somewhere behind her, the music shifted, just slightly, almost imperceptibly, one note landing a fraction too late, another held a second too long. No one noticed. No one except the man at the piano. Julian Cross kept his eyes on the keys, his fingers continuing their smooth, practiced motion, but something in his posture changed, something subtle, like a thread being pulled tight. He had heard the laughter. He had heard the tone. And now, for the first time that evening, he looked up, not at Victor, not at the crowd, but at Clara. And in that single glance, something passed between them, something quiet, something unspoken, something that didn't belong in a room like this. The music continued, but it no longer felt like background. It felt like a warning. Clara did not move right away, and that was the first thing that felt wrong to the room. Not the comment, not the laughter, but the stillness that followed, because people expected a reaction, a quick apology, a correction, something to restore the balance that had just been tilted, but she gave them none of it. Her hand steady on the tray, her shoulders relaxed, her gaze neither lowered nor confrontational, just present, as if she had stepped outside the moment while everyone else remained trapped inside it. Victor watched her for a second longer than necessary, his expression shifting slightly, curiosity replacing amusement, because defiance he understood, embarrassment he expected, but this quiet composure did not fit the pattern he was used to controlling. "Well," he said, tilting his head, his voice lighter now but edged with something sharper beneath. "Are you going to fix it, or just stand there?" The table chuckled again, softer this time, less certain, as if the rhythm of the moment had slipped just enough to make them unsure where to land. Clara set the tray down gently on the edge of the table, the faint sound of glass touching wood cutting through the noise more cleanly than any raised voice could have. "If there has been a misunderstanding, I can bring you another option," she said, her tone unchanged, calm, measured, each word placed carefully, not rushed, not defensive. Victor leaned back again, studying her now, really looking, as if trying to understand where the script had gone off course. Around them, conversation slowed, forks hovered midair, and somewhere behind it all, the piano continued, but the melody had shifted, the notes no longer drifting but pressing forward, deliberate, intentional. Julian's fingers moved across the keys with quiet precision, but his eyes were no longer on the music alone. They flickered between the ivory keys and the figure standing at table 12, tracking something deeper than the surface exchange, something that had not yet been spoken but was already unfolding. Another option, Victor repeated, almost amused, but there was less confidence in it now, less certainty that he was still leading the moment. Tell me, do you always speak like that? Clara met his gaze fully for the first time, not challenging, not submissive, simply direct. Like what, sir? She asked. The question was simple, but it landed differently, not as a defense, but as a mirror, forcing him to define the very thing he thought he understood. Victor hesitated, just briefly, and in that hesitation, something shifted again, subtle but undeniable. A few seats away, one of his colleagues cleared his throat, glancing between them, sensing the tension that no longer felt entertaining. The laughter had faded now, replaced by a quieter kind of attention, the kind that did not look for amusement, but for meaning. Clara remained exactly where she was, grounded, unshaken, her presence no longer blending into the background but anchoring the space in a way no one had anticipated. And then, without warning, the music stopped. Not gradually, not with a soft ending, but cleanly, decisively, as if someone had drawn a line through the moment and refused to let it continue as it was. The silence that followed was immediate and complete, heavier than the laughter had ever been. Julian's hands rested on the keys, unmoving, his gaze lifted now, no longer distant, no longer detached. He was looking directly at Clara, and this time, everyone noticed. No one spoke at first, because no one quite understood what had just happened, not the guests at the table, not the surrounding diners, and certainly not Victor, who remained seated with his hand still loosely wrapped around his glass. His expression caught somewhere between irritation and confusion, as if the evening had slipped beyond his control without his permission. Clara did not turn toward the piano immediately, but her eyes shifted, just slightly, acknowledging the silence that had replaced the music, the kind of silence that demanded attention rather than avoided it. Julian rose slowly from the bench, his movements unhurried, deliberate, as if he had already decided something long before this moment arrived, and now he was simply following through with it. The soft scrape of the piano bench against the polished floor echoed more loudly than it should have, drawing every gaze in the room toward him as he stepped away from the instrument and into the open space between tables. He did not look at Victor. He did not look at the crowd. He walked directly toward Clara. The distance was not far, maybe 20 feet, but it felt longer, stretched by the weight of every unspoken assumption hanging in the air. Clara remained where she was, her posture unchanged, her expression steady, but there was something in her eyes now, something deeper than before, not fear, not relief, but recognition, quiet and unmistakable. Julian stopped a few feet from her, close enough that his voice would carry without effort, but not so close as to invade her space, a subtle boundary that spoke of respect more clearly than any words could. For a moment, he said nothing, and that silence felt intentional, as if he was allowing the room to settle into a different rhythm before he spoke. Victor shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening slightly, the first visible sign that he was no longer comfortable, that the balance of the evening was no longer in his favor. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his tone sharper now, but lacking the earlier ease, the confidence that had once filled the room. Julian finally turned his head, his gaze calm, composed, but carrying a quiet authority that did not rely on volume or position. "There is," he said simply. The words were not loud, but they landed with weight, clear and steady, leaving no room for dismissal. A few guests exchanged glances, uncertain now, unsure whether they were witnessing a disruption or something more significant. Julian looked back at Clara, and when he spoke again, his voice softened, not weaker, but more personal, as if the room had momentarily ceased to exist around them. "You still do that," he said, almost to himself. Clara's lips pressed together gently, not in denial, not in surprise, but in quiet acceptance of something she had always known might return. Victor frowned, leaning forward slightly. "Do what?" he asked, impatience creeping back into his voice, though it no longer carried the same authority. Julian did not answer him immediately. Instead, he took a small breath, his eyes never leaving Clara's face. "You stand there," he continued, his voice even, "and let people think they understand you." The words hung in the air, simple, but layered with meaning that extended far beyond the moment. A subtle shift moved through the room, like a ripple beneath still water, as if something unseen had just been revealed without being fully explained. Clara finally spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "This is not the place, Julian," she said. The name landed like a spark in dry air. Victor's expression changed instantly, confusion giving way to something sharper, more alert. "You know each other," he said, not quite a question, not quite a statement. Julian's gaze lifted then, meeting Victor's for the first time, and in that brief exchange, something unmistakable passed between them, not confrontation, not aggression, but certainty. "Better than you think," Julian replied. And for the first time that evening, Victor Langford had nothing immediate to say. The air did not move, not a single glass shifted, not a single fork touched a plate, because whatever had just entered the room was no longer about service or status. It was about something older, something that could not be bought or dismissed, and everyone felt it even if they did not yet understand it. Victor leaned forward slowly, his fingers pressing lightly against the edge of the table, his gaze moving between Julian and Clara with growing intensity, trying to reconstruct control from fragments that no longer fit together. "Then maybe you should explain it," he said, his voice measured again. But this time it carried effort, the kind that revealed more than it concealed. Julian did not respond right away, and that pause stretched just long enough to shift the weight of the room further away from Victor and toward something quieter, something steadier. Clara exhaled softly, barely noticeable, her eyes lowering for the first time, not in submission, but in restraint, as if she was deciding how much of the past she was willing to let surface in a place that had never earned it. "It is not necessary," she said, her voice calm, almost gentle, but firm enough to draw a boundary. Julian's expression changed slightly, not disagreement, but recognition of that boundary, the same one he had seen before, the same quiet wall she had always placed between herself and the world when it tried to define her too quickly. He nodded once, a small acknowledgement, but he did not step back. Instead, he turned his gaze toward Victor again, his posture relaxed but grounded, the kind of presence that did not need to dominate to be felt. "You think this is about a drink," Julian said, his tone even, each word deliberate, but it never was. Victor's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing as he processed the statement, searching for the angle, the leverage, the point where he could reassert control. "Then what is it about?" he asked, sharper now, though the question carried more curiosity than authority. Julian glanced briefly at the table, at the untouched glass, at the faint reflection of the overhead lights shimmering on its surface, then back at Victor. "It is about what you see when you look at someone," he said. The simplicity of the sentence landed heavier than any accusation could have. A quiet shift moved through the surrounding tables, people straightening slightly, leaning in without realizing it, drawn into something that felt less like a confrontation and more like a revelation unfolding in real time. Clara remained still, her hands now resting lightly at her sides, her tray forgotten on the table behind her, as if the role she had been playing all evening had quietly dissolved without announcement. Victor let out a short breath, almost a laugh, but it did not carry the same ease as before. "I see a waitress who made a mistake," he said, though the certainty in his voice had thinned. Julian's gaze did not waver. "No," he replied softly. "You see what is convenient." The words did not rise, did not push, but they settled into the space with undeniable weight. Clara closed her eyes briefly, just a second, as if the truth in that sentence had brushed against something she had carried for a long time, something she had never needed to say out loud. When she opened them again, her expression was unchanged, but there was a quiet resolve beneath it now, something that did not ask for permission to exist. Victor shifted in his seat again, his confidence now fractured into smaller pieces, each one less certain than the last. "And what do you see?" he asked Julian, the The question almost defensive, almost searching. Julian did not hesitate this time. I see someone who has never needed to prove anything, he said, his voice steady. So she never does. The room fell deeper into silence, if that was even possible, because something about that statement felt final, like a door closing on a version of the story that could no longer continue. Clara looked at Julian then, really looked, and for a brief moment, something softened in her eyes. Not vulnerability, but acknowledgement, the kind that only exists between people who have shared something the rest of the world never witnessed. And in that moment, Victor Langford realized that whatever he had thought this evening was about, he had been wrong from the very beginning. The silence did not break, it deepened, settling into the room like something that had always been there, but had finally decided to be noticed. And for the first time that evening, Victor Langford felt it press against him instead of bending around him, a quiet resistance that did not argue, did not raise its voice, but refused to move. He leaned back slowly, his hand leaving the edge of the table as if even that small point of control had lost its meaning, his eyes shifting again toward Clara, but this time without the earlier dismissal, without the assumption that he already understood who she was. You are making this unnecessarily complicated, he said, though the words sounded thinner now, like they had been chosen out of habit rather than conviction. Clara did not respond right away, and when she did, her voice remained exactly as it had been from the beginning, calm, measured, untouched by the tension that had reshaped the room. No, she said quietly. It was always complicated. The statement did not challenge him, it corrected something deeper, something he had not realized he had oversimplified. A few heads turned at nearby tables, drawn not by volume, but by the weight of what was being said, the way each word seemed to reveal more than it explained. Julian watched her carefully, his expression steady, but there was something else beneath it now, something like respect that had not faded with time, something that had only grown quieter, more certain. Victor's brow furrowed slightly, the first real sign that he was no longer navigating familiar ground. Then explain it, he said, softer this time, not as a demand, but as a request that he did not quite know how to frame. Clara's gaze shifted past him, not avoiding him, but expanding beyond him, as if the answer he was asking for did not belong to him alone. You would not hear it, she replied. The words were simple, but they did not dismiss him, they revealed him, and that difference settled heavily into the space between them. Victor opened his mouth, then closed it again, the response he had prepared dissolving before it could take shape, because somewhere in that sentence, he recognized something uncomfortable, something accurate. Julian took a small step forward, not to interrupt, but to anchor the moment before it drifted back into misunderstanding. She is right, he said, his tone still even, but carrying a quiet certainty that no longer needed to prove itself. Victor looked at him again, this time not with irritation, but with something closer to curiosity, as if he was beginning to realize that whatever connection existed between these two people, it was not recent, and it was not superficial. Then you tell me, Victor said, the edge in his voice replaced by something more controlled, more careful. Julian held his gaze for a moment, measuring the question, not for its words, but for its intention. Then he spoke, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the kind of clarity that did not need to repeat itself. A few years ago, he began, there was a room not very different from this one, full of people who believed they knew exactly who they were dealing with. The sentence hung there, unfinished but already shifting the direction of the evening, pulling it backward into something unseen. Clara's eyes lowered slightly again, not in retreat, but in memory, as if she could already see where this was going and was deciding whether to let it unfold. Victor leaned forward once more, but this time not to dominate the moment, but to understand it, his attention no longer scattered across the room, but focused entirely on the words that were beginning to reshape everything he thought he knew. And somewhere in the stillness, it became clear that this was no longer about a mistake, or a drink, or even a single moment of embarrassment. It was about a truth that had been waiting, quietly, patiently, for the right moment to be heard. Julian did not rush the story, and that was what made people lean in closer, not because he demanded attention, but because he allowed the truth to arrive at its own pace, steady and unavoidable, like something that had waited long enough to no longer need permission. It was a charity event, he continued, his voice even, his eyes no longer fixed on Victor but somewhere beyond him, as if he were looking through the present into a memory that still carried weight. 500 guests. Cameras everywhere. People who cared more about appearances than outcomes. A subtle murmur moved through the room, not loud enough to interrupt, but enough to signal that the story had begun to take shape. Clara remained still, her expression composed, but her fingers tightened slightly at her sides, a small detail that only someone paying close attention would notice, and Julian noticed. "I was scheduled to perform," he said, "but something went wrong before I ever reached the stage." He paused, just long enough for the silence to settle again, not empty, but expectant. "A contract," he added, his gaze lowering briefly. "One I was told I had already agreed to." Victor's expression shifted, his attention sharpening, because this was familiar territory, contracts, agreements, leverage, the language of power he understood. "And you had not?" Victor asked, his voice quieter now, no longer leading, but following. Julian shook his head once. "No," he said simply. "But it did not matter what I said. Not in that room. Not with those people." The words carried no bitterness, only clarity, as if the lesson had already been learned long ago. Clara closed her eyes for a brief moment, then opened them again, her gaze steady, accepting that the past was no longer hers alone to keep. "They were ready to announce it," Julian continued. "Ready to put my name on something I had never agreed to, something that would have tied me to decisions I did not make." A few people at nearby tables exchanged glances, recognizing the weight of that kind of situation, the kind that did not need to be explained in detail to be understood. Victor leaned forward slightly, his focus now fully captured, his earlier confidence replaced by something more attentive, more careful. "So what happened?" he asked. Julian's eyes lifted then, not to Victor, but to Clara. "She happened," he said. The simplicity of the statement shifted the room again, drawing every gaze back toward the woman who had said almost nothing all evening. Clara did not react outwardly, but there was a quiet acknowledgement in her eyes. Not pride, not discomfort, just truth. She was not supposed to be in that room, Julian said, his voice steady, not in any way that mattered to them. He let that settle before continuing. But she noticed something no one else did. A detail, a discrepancy, something small enough to ignore if you were not paying attention. Victor's brow furrowed, his mind already moving, reconstructing possibilities, searching for the angle. "And she said something," Julian added. "Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough." Clara exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly, as if that moment had never really left her, as if it had simply been waiting beneath the surface all along. "They did not listen at first," Julian said, "because they did not expect her to be right." His gaze shifted back to Victor then, steady, direct. "But she was." The words landed without force, but they did not need it. The room felt smaller now, quieter, as if everything unnecessary had been stripped away. Victor sat back slightly, his expression no longer guarded, but thoughtful, the pieces beginning to move into place in a way he had not anticipated. "And that changed everything," Julian finished. Not as a question, not as a claim, but as a fact that no longer needed to be proven. Victor did not speak immediately, and that hesitation lingered longer than anything he had said before, because for the first time that evening, he was no longer trying to respond, he was trying to understand, and that required something he was not used to offering, attention without control. His gaze shifted back to Clara, but this time it held no trace of dismissal, only a quiet recalibration, as if he were seeing her again for the first time, without the filter he had applied so easily before. "And what did you see?" he asked, his voice lower now, stripped of performance, carrying a sincerity that had not existed in him just minutes ago. Clara remained still, her posture unchanged, but something in her expression softened, not in weakness, but in recognition that the question, finally, was real. She did not answer right away, and no one interrupted her, because the room had learned, in the span of a few minutes, that her silence was not emptiness, it was intention. "A number that did not belong," she said at last, her voice quiet but clear, each word placed carefully, not to impress, but to be accurate. Julian watched her as she spoke, his expression steady, as if he had heard these words before, or at least the truth behind them. It was small, Clara continued, but it changed the meaning of everything around it. Victor's brow furrowed slightly, his mind already working through the implications, because he understood numbers. He understood how something minor could shift the entire structure if placed in the right position. And no one else noticed? He asked. Clara shook her head once. They were not looking for it, she replied. The simplicity of the answer settled heavily into the space, because it was not about intelligence, it was about attention, about what people chose to see and what they chose to ignore. Julian took a small breath, stepping just slightly closer, not to interrupt, but to support the moment as it unfolded. She spoke up, he said, his voice calm, even though she was told not to. A quiet ripple moved through the listeners, subtle but unmistakable, because everyone understood what it meant to go against expectation, especially in a room where expectations were rarely questioned. Victor leaned forward again, his earlier posture of dominance replaced by something more open, more uncertain. And they listened? He asked. Clara's lips pressed together briefly, not in hesitation, but in memory. Eventually, she said, not because of me. She paused, just long enough to let that distinction settle. Because the truth did not change when they ignored it. The words did not rise, did not push, but they carried a weight that did not need reinforcement. Julian's gaze shifted to Victor again, steady, unwavering. That contract never went through, he said. Because of her. Victor sat back slowly, the realization moving through him in pieces, each one reshaping the way he saw the woman standing in front of him, the woman he had reduced to a mistake just moments ago. Around them, the room remained silent, not out of discomfort anymore, but out of something closer. To respect, the kind that arrives quietly and stays. Clara did not look at Victor when the understanding reached him. She did not wait for acknowledgement, did not seek it, because whatever she had done back then had never been about recognition, and whatever was happening now was no different. Victor's hand moved slightly on the table, not reaching for his glass this time, but resting there, as if he needed something steady to hold on to while the ground beneath his assumptions shifted. And you just walked away? He asked, the question softer than anything he had said before. Clara met his gaze then, not with defiance, not with pride, but with something far simpler. There was nothing to stay for, she said. And in that moment, Victor Langford understood that the power he thought he had never belonged to him in the first place. The room did not return to normal, because something essential had already shifted, something that could not be undone by simply continuing the evening as if nothing had happened, and everyone felt it in the way they held their glasses, in the way they avoided speaking too quickly, in the way their attention no longer drifted back to their own conversations. Victor remained seated, but his posture had changed completely, the ease replaced by a stillness that no longer came from confidence, but from reflection, as if he were recalculating something far more important than the situation itself. His eyes stayed on Clara, but they no longer tried to define her. They tried to understand her, and that difference was subtle, but undeniable. Clara nodded once, a quiet agreement that required no words. Victor noticed that exchange, and something about it unsettled him more than anything else that had been said, because it was not dramatic, it was not emotional, it was simply understood, and he realized that whatever connection existed between them did not depend on explanation. Wait, he said suddenly, the word leaving him before he had fully decided to speak, not loud, but urgent enough to stop the moment from dissolving completely. Clara paused, not turning immediately, but allowing the word to exist without reacting to it, as if she were deciding whether it deserved her attention. Slowly, she looked back at him. Victor stood this time, not abruptly, not to assert dominance, but because remaining seated no longer felt appropriate, and even that small realization carried meaning he could not ignore. I was wrong, he said, the words simple, unembellished, without justification or defense. The room held its breath again, but this time not in tension, in recognition. Clara studied him for a moment, her expression unchanged, not cold, not forgiving, simply present. That is not new, she replied quietly. The response did not insult him, it did not challenge him, it clarified something he had not yet fully grasped. Victor exhaled slowly, absorbing the weight of it, understanding that the apology he had offered did not resolve anything. It only acknowledged the beginning of something he had yet to learn. Then what is? He asked, not as a challenge, but as a question he genuinely did not know how to answer. Clara's gaze softened slightly, not toward him specifically, but toward the space between them, as if the answer did not belong to either of them alone. "What you choose to see next," she said. The words settled gently, but firmly, leaving no room for misinterpretation. Julian turned back toward the piano then, not because the moment had ended, but because it had reached its natural conclusion, and there was nothing left to add without diminishing it. He sat down again, his hands resting on the keys, waiting, not rushing, allowing the silence to complete itself before sound returned. Clara gave Victor one final glance, not lingering, not searching for reaction, just enough to acknowledge that the moment had been shared, and then she turned and walked away, her steps steady, unhurried, as if nothing had been taken from her, because nothing had. And as she disappeared back into the rhythm of the room, Victor Langford remained standing, realizing that for the first time in a long time, he was the one who had been seen clearly, and he was not yet sure what to do with that truth. Julian let the silence breathe for a moment longer before his fingers finally touched the keys again, and when the music returned, it was softer, slower, no longer background noise, but something intentional, something that carried the weight of everything that had just been said without repeating a single word. The melody unfolded carefully, each note placed with precision, as if it understood that the room itself had changed and needed something different now, something quieter, something honest. Clara had already moved away from the table, her steps steady as she returned to her section, picking up another order, refilling a glass, continuing the rhythm she had always known. But now the space around her responded differently, conversations lowering as she passed, glances following her not out of curiosity, but out of something closer to respect. She did not acknowledge it. She did not need to. At table 12, Victor slowly sat back down, the motion deliberate, controlled, but lacking the certainty it had carried earlier, as if even sitting required a different kind of awareness now. His hand reached for the glass in front of him, the same one he had dismissed before, and for a moment, he simply looked at it, the amber liquid catching the light in a way that had not changed at all, even though everything else had. He took a small sip, not evaluating it, not judging it, just tasting it, as if trying to understand something that had never been about the drink in the first place. Across from him, one of his colleagues shifted uncomfortably, glancing around before leaning in slightly. "Victor," he said quietly, "do you want to move on to the proposal?" The question felt out of place, almost inappropriate, and Victor noticed it immediately, not because it was wrong, but because it no longer mattered in the way it had before. He shook his head once, a small gesture, but enough. "Not yet," he said. The response surprised even him. A few tables away, Clara paused briefly as she placed a check on another table, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the paper, grounding herself in something simple, something real, before continuing. She did not look back toward Victor, but she was aware of the shift, the subtle change in the way the room held itself, the way the noise had not returned to its previous level, the way people seemed to be listening even when no one was speaking. Julian's music filled the space again, but now it carried something else, something reflective, almost like a conversation that did not require words. Victor's gaze lifted slowly, not searching this time, but observing, and it landed on Clara again, not because he needed to understand her, but because he was beginning to understand himself. The realization did not arrive all at once. It moved slowly, piece by piece, the memory of his own words echoing back to him in a way they had never done before, stripped of context, stripped of justification, leaving only what they actually were. He leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on the table, his fingers interlaced, not as a display of control, but as a way to stay present, to not retreat into the version of himself that had been easier to maintain. Around him, the room began to move again, but carefully, as if everyone had silently agreed not to disrupt whatever had been revealed. Clara moved past his table once more, her steps unchanged, her expression calm, her presence steady, and this time, Victor did not stop her, did not call out, did not try to insert himself back into her path. He simply watched her pass, understanding that whatever needed to change would not come from interrupting her again. And as the music continued, and the evening slowly found a new rhythm, Victor Langford realized that the most difficult part of the night had not been being corrected. It had been being seen clearly, without the distance he had always relied on, and knowing that from this moment forward, he could not unsee it. The music continued, steady and unintrusive, but now it felt like it was holding the room together rather than filling empty space. Each note anchoring the quiet shift that had taken place, allowing everything else to move without collapsing back into what it had been before. Victor remained seated, his gaze no longer fixed on any single point, but moving slowly, thoughtfully, as if he were seeing details that had always been there, but had never required his attention until now. A glass placed slightly off-center. A server adjusting a chair without being asked. The quiet coordination of people who made the evening possible without ever being acknowledged for it. He noticed all of it, and for the first time, it did not feel like background. It felt like structure. Clara moved between tables with the same measured rhythm, her steps light, her voice low, her presence calm. But now every interaction seemed clearer, more defined, as if the room itself had sharpened around her rather than softened. She smiled politely when needed, nodded when spoken to, but never lingered longer than necessary, never inserted herself into conversations that were not hers, maintaining the same boundary she had always carried, one that no longer looked like distance, but like discipline. At table 12, Victor's colleagues had resumed speaking in low voices, attempting to return to business, to proposals, to numbers that had once dictated the pace of the evening, but their words felt thinner now, less urgent, as if something more important had already been decided without their involvement. Victor listened, but only partially, his attention divided between what was being said and what he had begun to understand. "We should finalize this tonight," one of them said, gesturing lightly toward a folder on the table, his tone cautious, as if unsure how much weight his words still carried. Victor looked at the folder, then back at the room, his expression steady but changed. "Tomorrow," he said quietly. The decision was simple, but it altered the direction of the night more than any argument could have. Across the room, Clara paused briefly near the service station, her hand resting lightly on the counter as she adjusted the placement of a receipt, her movements precise, almost habitual, yet grounded in something deeper than routine. She did not look toward Victor, but she was aware of the shift, the way the energy of his table had softened, the way the urgency had faded. She did not need to confirm it. Julian's playing softened even further, the melody now carrying a reflective tone, as if it were closing a chapter that had not been expected to open. Victor's gaze lifted toward the piano again, not out of curiosity this time, but acknowledgement, and Julian met it briefly, a quiet exchange that did not require words, because whatever needed to be understood had already been placed into the room. Victor nodded once, subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough. Then his attention returned to Clara, not with intent to interrupt, not with the need to correct anything further, but with a different kind of awareness, one that did not seek to define her role, but to recognize it. He stood again, slowly this time, not drawing attention, not making a statement, but because remaining seated no longer aligned with the way the moment had changed. Clara approached the table once more, not because she had been called, but because it was part of her section, part of the rhythm she maintained regardless of who sat there. She stopped at a respectful distance, her posture relaxed, her expression neutral, waiting, not anticipating anything more than what was necessary. Victor looked at her, really looked, without assumption, without projection, and for a moment, he said nothing, because this time, he understood that the space between words mattered just as much as the words themselves. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, steady, and stripped of everything that had once made it easy. "Thank you," he said. Clara held his gaze for a brief moment, just long enough to acknowledge the sincerity behind it, and then she nodded once, not accepting, not rejecting, simply recognizing it for what it was. "You are welcome," she replied. And then she turned, continuing her work, leaving. Victor standing there with a realization that did not need to be spoken aloud, because it had already taken root in the only place that mattered. The room did not return to what it had been, because once something true is seen, it does not disappear when the moment passes. It settles quietly into the edges of everything that follows, shaping the way people speak, the way they listen, even the way they choose to remain silent. Victor remained standing for a moment longer after Clara walked away, his eyes following her path not out of habit, but out of a growing awareness that there was nothing left to demand, nothing left to correct, only something to understand, and that understanding would not come from calling her back again. Slowly, he sat down, the motion quieter than before, almost careful, as if even the simple act of taking his seat carried a different kind of responsibility now. Across the table, his colleagues exchanged subtle glances, unsure whether to resume the conversation or leave the silence intact, because whatever had unfolded no longer felt like something that could be easily stepped around. One of them finally cleared his throat, his voice low, tentative. "Victor, about the numbers," he began, gesturing lightly toward the open folder that had been forgotten for several minutes. Victor looked at it, then closed it gently, not with finality, but with intention. "They can wait," he said. The words were calm, but they carried weight, because for a man who had built his world on urgency and precision, choosing to pause meant something had shifted at a deeper level. A few tables away, Clara continued her work, her movements unchanged, her presence steady, but now there was a quiet rhythm around her that had not been there before, a space people seemed careful not to disturb. She delivered a plate, adjusted a glass, offered a soft, "Excuse me," as she moved past a chair, each action simple, but now clearly seen, clearly valued, even if no one said it out loud. Julian's music carried through the room again, gentle but grounded, each note landing with quiet clarity, as if reinforcing something that no longer needed to be explained. He did not look up. This time, because he did not need to. The moment had already been completed, and whatever came next belonged to the people who had witnessed it. Victor leaned back slightly, his gaze drifting once more across the room. But this time it did not search for control, it observed, it noticed, it absorbed. He saw Clara speaking softly to another table, her expression calm, her posture relaxed, and there was something in that image that unsettled him in a way he could not immediately define, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it had always been there, unnoticed. He realized then that what had changed was not her, it was him. The recognition settled slowly, not dramatic, not overwhelming, but steady, like something aligning into place after being misread for too long. He exhaled quietly, his hand resting flat against the table, no longer gripping, no longer asserting, just present. Around him, the evening continued, conversations resumed, glasses clinked softly, but there was a difference in the tone, a subtle restraint, a shared understanding that something meaningful had passed through the room and left its mark. Clara moved past his table one last time before the end of her section, her steps measured, her attention focused on the work in front of her, and Victor did not stop her, did not speak, because this time, he understood that not every moment needed to be held on to. Some moments were meant to be learned from, and then allowed to move on. As she disappeared once more into the quiet flow of the evening, Victor Langford sat in stillness, not as a man who had lost control, but as a man who had finally realized that control had never been the same thing as understanding, and that the difference between them was where everything that mattered truly began. The night moved forward, but not in the same way it had begun, because something subtle had taken root beneath the surface, something that no longer needed to be spoken to exist, and the room carried it in quiet ways, in softened voices, in slower gestures, in the way people now noticed things they had overlooked just hours before. Victor remained at the table, but his presence no longer commanded attention. It blended into the space with a kind of awareness that had not existed in him before, as if he had stepped out of the role he had always played and into something less defined, but more real. His colleagues spoke again, cautiously at first, returning to business, to numbers, to projections measured in percentages and timelines. But even those conversations felt different now, less urgent, less absolute, as if the certainty they once relied on had been gently questioned. Victor listened, nodding occasionally, but his attention drifted, not in distraction, but in reflection, returning again and again to the quiet exchange that had reshaped his understanding in ways he was still processing. Across the room, Clara moved with the same steady rhythm, her section nearly complete, her tasks finishing one by one with the same precision she had carried all evening. Yet now each action seemed to exist within a space that acknowledged her presence without demanding it. A guest thanked her as she cleared a plate, Another offered a small smile as she refilled a glass. Gestures that would have gone unnoticed before, but now felt intentional, as if something had shifted not only in Victor, but in the room itself. Clara accepted each interaction with the same calm grace, neither encouraging nor dismissing it, simply allowing it to exist without changing her own pace. Julian's music began to draw toward a close, the melody softening, resolving into something quieter, something that felt less like a performance and more like a conclusion, not abrupt, not dramatic, but complete. He let the final notes linger just a second longer than expected, then lifted his hands from the keys, allowing the silence to return naturally, without forcing it. A few guests offered gentle applause, not loud, not performative, but genuine, and Julian acknowledged it with a small nod before stepping away from the piano once more. Victor watched him briefly, then turned his gaze back toward Clara, who was now near the exit of the dining room, placing her order pad into the pocket of her apron, signaling the quiet end of her shift. There was no announcement, no moment of departure that demanded attention, just a transition, simple and unremarkable to anyone who had not been paying attention. But Victor noticed. He stood again, not out of impulse this time, but with intention, his movements measured, his expression composed, and he took a step forward before stopping himself, recognizing that not every action required completion, that sometimes the understanding itself was enough. Clara adjusted her jacket lightly over her shoulders, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, and without looking back, she walked toward the door, her steps steady, unhurried, carrying nothing from the evening with her except what had always been hers. The door opened softly, letting in a brief breath of cool night air, then closed again, leaving the room exactly as it had been physically, but not the same in any other way. Victor remained where he was, his gaze resting on the place where she had stood just moments before, not with regret, not with urgency, but with a quiet acceptance of something he could not undo and did not need to. And as the room slowly returned to its ordinary rhythm, Victor Langford understood that some people do not change the room by speaking louder, but by remaining exactly who they are, until the room has no choice but to see them clearly. The door had already closed, but something of Clara Whitmore remained, not in the room itself, but in the way it now held its silence, in the way conversations resumed with a softer edge, in the way even the smallest gestures carried more weight than before. Victor did not move for a long moment, not because he did not know what to do, but because for the first time, he understood that not every moment required action, some only required acknowledgement. He looked around the dining room, at the polished tables, the quiet staff, the subtle choreography that had always existed beneath his notice, and he realized how much he had missed by only seeing what was useful to him. Julian stood near the piano, his hands resting lightly at his sides, his posture relaxed, as if the role he had played tonight had never been about performance, but about presence, about stepping forward only when it mattered and stepping back when it did not. Their eyes met briefly, and Victor gave a small nod, not as a gesture of status, but of understanding, the kind that does not need to be explained. Julian returned it just as simply, then turned away, leaving the moment exactly where it belonged. Victor reached for his coat, slipping it on slowly, his movements no longer rushed, no longer driven by the need to control what came next, but guided by something quieter, something more deliberate. His colleagues watched him, unsure whether to follow, to speak, to ask, but he did not invite them into this part of the evening, because this was not something that could be negotiated or shared. It was something that had to be carried individually. As he walked toward the exit, the staff moved around him as they always had, but now he noticed them, not as background, but as people, each with their own rhythm, their own quiet dignity, their own stories that did not need to be announced to exist. He paused briefly near the doorway, his hand resting on the handle, and for a moment, he looked back, not searching for Clara, because he knew she was already gone, but acknowledging the space where she had stood, the place where everything had shifted without force, without demand. Then he stepped outside into the cool night air, the city moving around him in its usual rhythm, headlights passing, distant voices blending into the hum of something larger than any single moment. But he felt different within it, not transformed in a dramatic way, not suddenly changed into someone else, but adjusted, aligned, aware in a way he had not been before. He stood there for a moment, letting the air settle, letting the quiet understanding take root fully, and then he walked forward, not faster, not slower, just differently. Inside, the restaurant continued, the lights still warm, the music now silent, but the echo of it remained, carried in the memory of those who had witnessed something simple yet undeniable. Because in the end, Clara had not raised her voice, she had not defended herself, she had not needed to prove anything at all, and that was what changed everything. She had simply remained who she was, until the truth made itself impossible to ignore. And sometimes, that is how dignity works, not by demanding recognition, but by standing still long enough for the world to catch up. If you have ever witnessed a moment like that, or if this story stayed with you in a quiet way, take a second to share what you felt, because the stories we remember are often the ones that remind us to see a little more clearly and to treat the people around us with the respect they may never ask for, but always deserve.